Hey everyone, so in this video I want to present a full repertoire for white against the Sicilian defense, against the D6 Sicilian based around the Moscow variation. So yeah, we're going to be looking at the three main variations, and in the first variation we're going to be looking at the most popular move. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, the move we're going to be looking at is this move bishop e5 check. So personally I started to get really attracted to this variation because there was a game that Kasparov played against. It was like known as like Kasparov versus the world, where basically the world had like multiple grandmasters in their team, and then they put forward a set of moves that the rest of the world could choose from. And then Kasparov used this move, even though he's well known to be like an open Sicilian player, and he managed to win that game very nicely. And yeah, of course the theory has evolved a lot since that match, but yeah, it's very interesting and it's very positional, which I really like because it just keeps a stable, small but still stable advantage. So yeah, in this position bishop d7 is the most popular move. It makes a lot of sense, just blocking with the bishop, but now we can take on d7, trading. And here the main move is to play queen takes d7, though let's look at knight takes d7 first. This is quite solid because you put the knight on d7, you just develop, but the knight isn't optimally placed here because normally it would like to go to c6 to control the d4 square. So now we can simply play castles, and after knight g to f6 we can play the move queen e2. I like the move queen e2 instead of rook e1 because the queen is just developing quickly, and we're not sure if we want to put this rook on e1 or on d1. And additionally, we can play c3 and d4 really quickly. So for example, if black plays a slow move like g6 here, then I think that in general, if we're able to play c3 and d4 before black is able to kind of get this setup with their optimal dragon setup here, then they're going to be in some trouble because we are also threatening, let's say after we play c3, d4, we are also intending e5 followed by e6. So that's quite disruptive. And so here white should play c3, preparing d4, bishop g7, and then pawn to d4. And there's already the threat of e5 to e6. For example, castles, e5, takes, knight g4, then e6 here. And one game I had against an international master continued f takes e6 in a blitz game, queen takes e6, and then they resigned here because they're losing the knight. So yeah, instead of that, knight e5 is the best move, but now we can take on f7, ruining the pawn structure, knight takes f7, queen c4, attacking the knight and also pinning this knight on f7. Queen c8 is best, but now after knight d2, white has simple moves like rook e1 or like knight e4, and just long term this pawn on e7 becomes a real weakness. So white is doing very well there. Instead of that, c6 d4 makes some sense, but after c6 d4, the nice thing about this position is that we can simply play the move knight c3 next, which we normally don't have the option of if black doesn't take on d4. But now our knight gets a really nice square on c3. We can play moves like h3, bishop e3, or even bishop g5, and then maybe continue with like a4, a5, and just play on both sides of the board. And yeah, it's a really good position. Instead, if they play the move e5, just trying to prevent white from pushing e5, we can now take on e5. And the thing is that the king is still stuck in the center, so we can really take advantage of that. So after d takes e5, we play with the move rook d1. And the fact that the knight is on d7 here instead of the square on c6 makes our next plan very strong. After black plays the move queen c7, we have the very nice and thematic move c4. Now the idea is that our knight is simply getting to d5, and we're able to get this knight to d5, before black is able to put their knight from d7 to like a square like d4, because we are at the end of the day giving the outpost on d4, but we gain the access on d5. So here, if black immediately goes knight b8, we are just a bit faster here, and we can immediately play knight d5. So what should be better here? Moves like bishop g5 are coming. Black shouldn't really take on d5 because we'll just play c takes d5 with a really nice pass pawn. So instead of that, they can play knight b8. Instead of knight b8, they can play castles here. But now we play knight c3. And if they play a move like knight b8 now, then we can still go for knight d5. Obviously, taking on d5 is not good because instead of rook takes d5, I think simple c takes d5 is just, much better for white. We always want to take with the c pawn because we are also freeing up the c4 square for the knight later on, maybe pawn to a4 later also. And yeah, this bishop is just bad on g7. So instead of that, queen d6 is better, just blockading the knight. But now we play bishop g5, threatening to win the queen with knight takes f6. And so now knight takes d5 is best, but now again we play c takes d5, we prepare knight d2 to c4. F5 is like the most challenging move, you know, trying to challenge the center. But now we play knight d2, trying to reinforce the center and also preparing knight c4, h6, bishop e3. F4 seems like it's trapping our bishop, but we just simply play knight c4, drop the bishop back to d2. And after, let's say, knight d7, we can play a4 here. And we have a really nice bind on both sides of the board. You know, we have a nice pawn in the center. Yeah, we have a passed pawn. This bishop on g7 is bad. We can later play the move pawn to f3 to prevent black from playing f3 themselves. And just even maybe play a5 or like b3, solidify the position. And yeah, it's just a much better position right now. So yeah, instead of queen d6 and like this entire plan with knight b8, maybe h6 here makes some sense, preventing any bishop g5 ideas. But we can just play bishop e3, and we don't need to play knight d5 immediately, because that may allow black to like kind of free up the position a bit. Let's say knight d5, cd5, maybe f5 here, you know, getting some counterplay. So yeah, if possible, we want to wait a bit. We just play bishop e3, developing rook f to e8. Now a4, some useful improving moves before committing to knight d5. Let's say pawn to b6. Now pawn to h3 makes a lot of sense. Control the g4 square. Queen b7, and now rook d6. This is very nice, preparing to double up the rooks on the d file. So we see that we don't need to exactly like put the knight on d5 here, because we can also make use of the d file right now. And obviously you cannot take on e4 because later the knight on d7 is hanging. So after king h7, we can also play a5 and just, you know, undermine black's position significantly, double up rooks on the d file with a much better position. So yeah, in general, this idea of playing g6 is not really good in this setup, and we just need to know like in what positions g6 is best and in what positions g6 is not good. So in positions like this, generally, if white hasn't committed the pawn to, like, for example, c4, then we don't really want to, then black doesn't really want to play g6, because if we do get the pawn on c4, then g6 makes a lot of sense because we simply enter, you know, a typical Maroczy bind, and we know that in the Maroczy bind the bishop belongs on g7 against the long diagonal control with d4 square. But if white hasn't committed either the pawn to c3 or the pawn to d3, it means that their idea of going c3 and d4 comes really fast. So black is not ready to play a move like g6. Instead, after queen e2, black has to play the move e6 here. So preparing, the idea is that if we play c3, bishop e7, d4, then black has this typical equalizing pattern by taking and playing d5. Let's say e5 and then knight e4. And black is getting equality here because, yeah, eventually we'll maybe play a move like knight d2, and then they'll trade off the knight and black will get a fine position, later challenging our center with a move like f6. So yeah, this is okay. Instead, after e6, I like the move d4 here. And the point is that we just changed the position to an open Sicilian, but the knight is on d7, which is kind of a bad version. So yeah, it's not that bad, but it's like, you know, it's quite a nice plus of the position. After c takes d4, knight takes d4, white just gets a good version of the Maroczy bind. So we play pawn to c4, and yeah, let's say black castles, knight to c3, knight belongs here, controlling the d5 square, and we just need to understand that in the Maroczy bind we're controlling both of the d5 and the b5 squares, so we're preventing both of those pawn breaks. After black plays a6, now we continue with b3 followed by bishop e2, and the bishop is simply unopposed on this long diagonal, which is quite nice. Let's say rook c8, bishop e2, rook e8, and rook 8 to d1, and white has a nice space advantage here. You know, they can eventually think about playing f4 and then bringing the rook over with the rook d3 to g3 and just get a really nice position. Let's say queen a5, f4, queen h5 trying to trade queens, but then we can play rook f3 and we're just maintaining the pressure. Instead, if they play a move like b5, then we can play e5 now immediately, just challenging the knight. b4, e takes f6, this goes into kind of a forcing sequence. We can take on c3 here, queen takes c3, f takes e7, and if they take on e7 now, then we have the move knight f5, forking the rook and the pawn, which is why queen e2 is also like a really nice move in this position. Instead, if they play the move knight f6, we can play g4 here, followed by g5 next. Say d5, then I think, yeah, move like g5 here, or f5, yeah, g5 is probably the best move. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, white is much better in this position. So yeah, this is quite a nice variation, and essentially we covered this move, knight takes d7 in response, which is like, it seems solid at first glance, but if white knows like the proper setup, you know, when to choose the Maroczy bind and when not to choose the Maroczy bind, then they should be getting quite a good position. Instead here, queen takes d7 is the most popular move. And in this position, I like the simple move pawn to c4. Now the point is that we're establishing the Broxy bind, and this is the critical test to the entire, bishop d7 line that black is choosing. And in this position, black has a bunch of different move orders. Like for example, they should probably play the move knight c6 here. Now the reason is that if they play the move knight f6, then okay, this has a bit of independent value, but let's say knight c3. Black will probably play knight c6, pawn to d4 takes, and then go for g6 followed by bishop g7, and this will transpose to the main line. However, in this variation with the move knight f6 first, knight c3, we can also see what happens if, let's say, they play g6 here and they don't commit with the knight to c6. We can still play d4, cd4, knight d4, bishop g7, and now because we want to play the move bishop e3 in the short castle, we don't want to allow allow black to play the move knight g4, which would harass our bishop on e3. So we play the move f3 first. Very typical idea. Black can play the move queen c7 here, targeting the c4 pawn, also intending maybe queen a5 jumps. This has been tried in the past, but we can play b3, queen a5. Interesting idea, which kind of forces our bishop to go to either b2 or d2. On d2, it isn't ideal, I think, even though it's possible. It does target the queen, but there are no good discovered attacks. So I like the move bishop e2 here. Just really nice diagonal for the bishop. In general, we want the bishop on e3, but in this position, I don't see why bishop e2 is a bad move, because we don't really want to go to d2 here, just preventing stopping the or closing down the d file here and the defense over the knight. So here knight c6 possible. We just castle, and here we're gonna follow this Carlsen game, which continued with the move knight c to e2, and he would play this against Anand in 2012, and this came after rook fd8. Okay, the idea of knight c to e2 is obviously if you take on d4, then the knight can replace itself on d4, and still you can control a lot of the I believe you can take with the knight here. Yeah, either taking with the knight or the bishop are fine. With the knight takes d4, you are controlling the b5 square still. If bishop takes d4, you are at least opening up the diagonal. So both make a lot of sense. Instead, the move continued. The game continued rook f to d8, bishop c3, kicking the queen away, queen to b6, king h1, getting away from the long diagonal, makes sense. And now pawn to d5 was played. Just trying to strike in the center. And this is something that we need to be aware of. If we're not careful, then black can simply equalize here. Let's say cd5, knight takes d5. Yeah. If the point is cd5, then I guess there is knight takes d5. Yeah. Or knight takes d4, bishop d4. No. Yeah, knight takes d5. e5. I guess rook d5 here. Yeah, this is kind of the move I missed before, but yeah, there's too much pressure on the knight here. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense why this doesn't work. And so after pawn to d5, white has to take on c6 here. And after b takes c6, we can play the move queen e1 here. And yeah, pushing the d pawn is possible, but still white has a nice space advantage still with the pawn on e4 and c4. So here Nan played the move rook d to c8, which is kind of inaccurate because it allows the move pawn to e5. After knight to e8, the move play in the game is e6, which is interesting, but f4 here is supposedly stronger. After, let's say, e6, the bishop can go to a5, attacking the queen. We can play c5 next, and later we have ideas of playing knight d4, opening up the square. This bishop on g7 is quite bad. So let's say bishop f8, we can defend with rook c1, and white has an interesting setup here where they can simply play the move pawn to b4, pawn to a3 to defend the b4 pawn later, and the knight d4 going with the rook lift and getting a really nice position. It's kind of strange with this bishop on a5, but it's actually quite a nice piece on this diagonal, since at the end of the day it is preventing black's queen from activating on the a file as well. So yeah, that's quite a nice position. But that's obviously a sideline. This queen c7 move is not popular. Instead, castling is way more popular, and in this position it's important to play the move bishop e3. Now, why do we play bishop e3 first instead of castling? It's because if we play castling, then our queenside development is not finished, right? Our queenside development, we need to still move this bishop out, play pawn to b3, and then rook c1, and then get a nice position. But in this position, black has the move rook c8, and if we play pawn to b3, because the diagonal is so weak and we've undefended, we don't have enough defense over both of our knights, black can play the move d5. And this is good for black because after ed5, they have to move, yeah, knight takes d5 here. And our knight on c3 is undefended, so we cannot take with the pawn. And if we take with the knight, then black plays move e6. And after they move, yeah, after they play the move e6, they should be able to win back the piece. Yeah, while also opening up their bishop's diagonal. So this is good for black. So seeing that, we actually need to play the move bishop e3 first. And so now rook c8, like obviously if they play knight c6, then we transpose into the mainline after castles. But if they play the move rook c8 here, now it doesn't work that well because after b3, we are controlling the d5 square a lot and we've defended our knight on d4. So the move d5 doesn't really work. And so here a6 here makes a lot of sense. But now in general, I like to prevent the b5 advance. So playing a move like a4 here makes a lot of sense. Let's say knight c6, castles. And the best move here, yeah, is to kind of like see that this queen is not really good on this square, which is not intuitive at first. And I had a game in a tournament in Germany where my opponent kind of played the move knight b4 here, I believe, and then went for this queen d8, knight d7. But yeah, like, yeah, even though we kind of weakened the dark squares on the queen side, it doesn't really matter because black can't take advantage of it. The main point is that we're preventing both of black's breaks on d5 and also with pawn to b5. So here queen d8 immediately trying to go to a5 makes a lot of sense, also freeing up the d7 square for the knight. And now rook b1. I like this move because it prophylactically defends the b3 pawn. For example, if black plays queen a5 to b4, then our b3 pawn is always you know, defended. And also this bishop on this diagonal, you know, it's kind of putting pressure on the rook, so we want to get the rook out of the way. Queen a5 here, knight d to e2. This is a nice move because in general, we don't want to exchange pieces in the proxy bind. So playing a move like knight d to e2 when it's properly timed is really nice. And we're going to continue with like queen d2, king h1, and just get a nice position. Let's say knight g4 here is one of the tries trying to you know, double the pawns here and attack the knight to c3. But now we can play a move like queen d5. And here in general, black never wants to take on d5. Not just because it loses a piece right now because of the doubled attack. But also because in general this pawn on e7 becomes the backward pawn, and later like moves like rook e1 really put pressure on it, and this is a very typical structure we need to understand. Instead, black can play the pawn to e6, but now we can take on d6 here, pawn bishop e5 and the queen d2, and we're going to be simply up a pawn. So this entire idea of, you know, avoiding the move knight c6 to try to get in castles and rook c8 doesn't really work out for black. Yeah, instead e6 is possible. You know, it's quite passive, and yeah, I just really like it in the proxy bind if black goes for this e6 idea, because at the end of the day, this d6 pawn becomes a weakness. Let's say d4 takes, and then later we see that this d6 pawn becomes just a long-term weakness if black is unable to get an e5. Let's say they play knight c6 here, with the idea that we no longer have ideas of developing the queen to e2 because our knight on d4 is hanging. So here we just castle, bishop e7, and because we can't get in the queen e2 setup, we just play bishop e3, finishing development. We see that we don't need to play the move f3 yet because the knight g4 is not threatened, right? Instead, black should castle. Now we can play queen e2, which is nice because it defends, you know, controls the b5 square, preventing any future b5 advances. You know, develops queen, connects the rooks, and so after a6 here, which is quite useful, rook a to d1. And yeah, we just get the rooks to nice places like f4 here, and we have ideas. Rook a c8, pawn to b3, just yeah, just defending the c4 pawn, and we just have ideas of like continuing with the rook lift, maybe going king h1, getting the king out of danger on the diagonal, and also preparing bishop g1 at some point if needed. And so white just has a nice edge here. So instead of knight c6 here, bishop e7 is possible. Let's say castles, but without the inclusion of knight c6, we can actually play queen e2, preparing a typical setup with b3 and bishop b2. So yeah, it's a bit different, you know. In the position we saw before with knight c6 included, we kind of had to develop the bishop to e3, but in here we can get the bishop nicely on the long diagonal, which is quite effective against the bishop e7 setup because black is not able to contest the long diagonal. So here a6, we play b3, queen c7, bishop b2, knight b to d7, now rook a d1. And again, white has typical ideas of, you know, king h1, f4, and then going with the rook left, and you know, a very nice position. It's nothing to complain about. Instead of pawn to e6 here, knight c6 is yeah, is the best move, and for pawn to d4, yeah, it's possible. I mean, Queen g4 is like the alternative here. If you take on d4, then it'll just transpose to the main line. You know, black has to play g6 now, or get a worse position. Otherwise, queen g4 is an interesting trying to attack the g2 pawn, also attacking e4. But now, we can play the move pawn to d5. And black's main move is to play the move knight d4, attacking r knight on f3, so we have to take essentially. And the point is that white takes on d1, and we play the move king takes d1. And after c takes d4, our e4 pawn is actually hanging, but we have the very nice move knight b5, threatening knight c7, attacking d4 as well. So now black cannot take on e4. They may be thinking that, you know, they can win the f2 pawn and then fork our king and the rook, but we have the nice intermezzo rook e1, attacking the knight, and we can later go with knight c7 next. So instead, rook c8 is best, attacking c4 and still e4. Now we can play b3. If they play a6 here, keep the knight back, we can take on d4, knight takes e4 and king e2. And we have a slight edge here because this is generally a favorable structure. Like we can play bishop e3, rook a to c1, rook h to d1, and we have a nice position because this pawn structure is just very favorable. You know, this is a backward e6 pawn, e7 pawn, and because our pawn is on d5, we just get the ideal structure. Instead of that, if they play knight takes e4, which is a bit trickier, we can play rook e1, knight takes f2, and now the very important move, very counterintuitive, king d2. Now the point is that we're actually threatening knight takes d6 here. And so for example, rook d8 is best, but now we play h3, and the knight is really asking to get trapped here. Let's say after g6 here, threatening bishop h6 check, white can play bishop e2, bishop g7 now, you know, we're attacking d4, so bishop g7, bishop takes d4, takes, f5 here is the only way to try to rescue the knight. We can play king e3, knight to e4, and even though we're, you know, after this move g4, white is down a pawn, but white has an advantage here because this structure is just very, very weak. You know, there are weaknesses on the e6 square, on the light squares, and black is unable to like, you know, consolidate in time. So black is doing, so white is doing well. So we see that in the sideline with queen g4, it's interesting and like quite a rare one, but it's quite tricky. So we need to know something against that. So we've essentially looked at the move knight f6, the move order with knight f6. If they play the move pawn to e5, this is very double-edged because, yeah, like in general, black doesn't want to play the move pawn to e5 if our pawn is still on c2, because then we can strike the center with like c3 and d4 very quickly. But in this position, it's not really possible for us to do that. So while black is arguing that, you know, they've weakened the d5 square, but we've also weakened the d4 square. But here, knight c3. We continue, we just develop towards the center, controlling the d5 square, knight c6, castles, and g6. And the thing is that even with the bishop on g7, you know, the pawn on e5 is blocking its diagonal. So here, white should continue with the queenside play. So one pawn break to go for, the only one that I see realistically is this typical queenside advance with a3 and b4. So white should play a3. And this was recommended by Arthur Nixons in his 2018 Modern Chess database. After bishop g7, white can even continue with pawn to d4, pawn to b4. The point being that if you take on b4, a takes b4, knight takes b4, white gets really nice play following bishop a3. Knight comes back to c6, and then knight b5, and black is facing a lot of problems here. Let's say bishop f8, defending the pawn, and now pawn to d4 here. After a6, white comes back to knight to c3, and just gets a nice advantage here. Yeah, this is really nice. We just have a big lead in development. The d5 square is still weak. And we have some nice pressure in the center. So instead of c takes b4, knight g7 is best. But now we can play b takes e5, d takes c5, and now pawn to d3. And even though we are creating a weakness on d3 here, at some point we can plug up the hole with knight d5. For example, after castles, we can immediately play knight d5. And black can play f5 here, which is like the only, instead of f5, b5 is the only pawn break I see. But f5, tries to liberate this bishop. But just long term, we can see that this bishop is a problem, which is why this entire system with pawn to e5 doesn't make a lot of sense. And I like the move a4 here, which was tried by Hakobian. Yeah, he won a really nice game here in 2019. After pawn to b6, the game continued bishop d2, f takes e4, d takes e4, and it's just, the problem is that, we see that this bishop just never gets active. So knight d4, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and now queen b3 here, just improving the position of the queen, controlling the d3 square as well. Knight takes d5, c takes d5, rook f to e8, and now rook fe1. And if you look at the position, it's quite double-edged, but surprisingly, like white's advantage is quite significant here. So yeah, after a6 here, trying to prepare b5, rook ac1, preventing b5 because the c5 pawn will drop. So rook a to b8 is possible, but now we'll continue with bishop f4. So that's quite a nice tempo to gain. Instead of that, rook ac8 was chosen, and then now we can actually take on b6, pawn to c4, you know, getting a lot of pawns rolling, queen takes a6, pawn to c3, bishop f4. And the thing is that, you know, black is unable to push these pawns forward because white is always able to blockade with the queen later. And yeah, these pawns are not really are strong, but they're also vulnerable in a sense. Black played queen f7 in this game, but now after bishop g3, still keeping control over the long diagonal. Bishop h6, now pawn to f4 is nice because after bishop f4, white will trade into this position where they're still up a pawn, and white has the move d6 here, threatening d7. Rook f8 was chosen, now d7, queen f2, king h1, rook c to d8, rook f1, hitting the queen, queen e3, rook c to e1, chasing the queen away, rook takes f1, rook f1, and now you cannot take on d7 still because there's the move queen e8. Yeah, and then king g7, queen f8. So that's simply checkmate. And instead of that, queen takes e4 is, I think, was played, and after queen f6, attacking the rook, queen a8 is the only move, but after queen e6, black simply resigned here because after king h8, there's the move rook f7, and white is the one getting to the black king first. So yeah, quite a really really nice game, model game from Jacobian there. So yeah, the main point is that yeah, we just see that the black's bishop on g7 just becomes quite a bad piece if they ever play the move pawn to e5 themselves. So yeah, instead of pawn to e5, knight c6 here is best. And here it's important that we don't castle early. It's very important. I've fallen into this move order trick a couple of times. We need to play the move knight c3 followed by d4 and then bishop e3 or like f3 really quickly. Right now d4. So I like this move, d4, just, you know, maybe at some point we want to play knight c3, maybe sometimes we play f3 or like bishop e3 first, but the main point is that we don't castle early. After we play d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, black has the move either g6 or knight f6. If they play knight f6, we'll play knight c3, and in this position there are a lot of moves that black can play, a lot of sidelines. You know, g6 transposes to the main line, e5 here, we just go knight c2, and the problem is that this d6 pawn becomes a weakness, and, you know, black, if they ever want to like position the bishop on this long diagonal, it's just really blocked off by their own pawn. So, you know, we have a really nice position here. Instead, they can go for e6 here, but again, this is generally like quite a passive setup. We just play castle, here bishop e3, and we actually saw this line before. You know, queen e2, rook fd1, b3, rook ac1, things like that with a nice position. And yeah, instead of that, queen g4 is possible now, and it's a bit different from the position before because we see that in this position they do offer the exchange of queens, but it's a bit different. After queen takes g4, knight takes g4, we can take on c6 and play the move bishop f4, and this is, I think, the most challenging move. The idea is that white still has the grip on d5 because of the Marxi bind structure, and they have a lead in development. So this is a slight advantage for white. Black can try to play the move g5 here, which is interesting, but it's not very good. The idea is after bishop takes g5, they want to get in the move knight e5 in, and they have threats of either knight d3 or even knight takes e5 here, and knight takes c4 here. And we can play b3 here, rook g8, at the end of the day winning the g2 pawn, but we can play bishop h4. And they cannot take on g2 now because we play bishop g3, and simply we play king f1 next, trapping the rook. So instead of that, rook g4 is possible. The main point is after bishop g3 and bishop g7, they try to get the bishop on this long diagonal. However, I don't think the compensation is sufficient because we have to move king d2, and we simply have a pawn up. Though the results have been kind of interesting in this position, but still, you know, black is the one that has to prove the advantage. The compensation. Instead, bishop g7 immediately makes some sense, but again, king d2, and this is, you know, better than the version with rook g4 and the bishop g7, but still, black doesn't realistically have enough compensation here, you know, from a human perspective at least. Like, the only way the computer says like to kind of equalize, I believe, is like a combination of like c5, knight c6, followed by knight d4, you know, blockading, getting a nice knight in the center, but it's really just an attempt to equalize. Like, black is not fighting for the win here, they're just like down a pawn, trying to defend a worse position. So instead of g5 here, rook b8 is possible, attacking b2, but now we kick the knight away with h3, knight f6, and now we can long castle here. And after knight d7, which is the most common move, we can centralize the rooks, g6, and now pawn to e5 is very nice. And after d takes e5, we even have the very nice move rook takes e5. The main point is that you cannot take on e5 here because there's going to be a fork on the two rooks. And we've essentially created a lot of weaknesses here. And rook takes e5 is an easy move to miss. Like, you know, it's like you expect bishop takes e5, but rook takes e5 just ruins the pawn structure completely. And white has moves like rook a5 here, just, you know, putting pressure on black's position. And, you know, easy advantage here. So queen g4 doesn't make much sense, but you know we need to know that move, the following move, bishop f4, and what are black's tries there. Instead g6 here, yeah, is important. And here we shouldn't castle. The problem is that there's always the threat of bishop g7 followed by knight takes e4. Let's say we play bishop e3. Now black has the move knight g4, which is quite annoying. And if we play the move f3, then now black has the move knight takes e4. And so this shows the problem of like castling early, is that, yeah, our knight in d4 isn't defended and we're not in time to play the move f3. Which is why in this position, we need to prevent knight g4 by playing f3 ourselves. And so here if black plays bishop g7, bishop e3, this transposes to the main line. Instead, they can also take on d4 immediately. And I just want to point this out because this is definitely a possible line. Seeing that at least after queen takes d4, the queen is kind of vulnerable on the long diagonal. But now we play bishop e3, no, you know, no threatening discovery checks or discovered attacks, and now black can castle. But now we simply drop the queen back to d3. You know, the queen is quite nice on the d3 square, still controlling b5. We can now consider castling short, playing rook a c1, rook f to d1 or e1, and b3, and then later maybe playing knight d5. Yeah, and just get a really nice position here. Even though black manages to exchange a set of pieces, which is generally what they want to do, in this position, it doesn't really solve all of their problems either. So, yeah, anyways, let's go to the main line here after g6. We play knight c3, bishop g7, now bishop e3. So remember, it's important to, yeah, develop our pieces like this, just to defend the knight, and later we want to play the move pawn to f3, preventing knight g4. And after castles and castles, we have a typical, actually an atypical Maroczy-bind position, because normally the Maroczy-bind in, like, for example, the dragon, or in a lot of Khan positions, okay, maybe not Khan positions, because that's more of a hedgehog, but in this kind of position, yeah, black has essentially exchanged of like their light squared bishop for white's light squared bishop, meaning that they've successfully managed to exchange like a set of pieces, which is generally what they want to do. You know, you know, the general rule is that if we're low on space, then we want to trade pieces because it will make the position easier to play. But in this position, yeah, that's something that can be argued for black, but you know, we still have some really nice space, and we have a simpler position to play here, because black is the one that always needs to strive for playing breaks like either d5 or b5. And here, to be honest, yeah, my honest analysis is that there is one line that is managing to equalize forcefully in the Maroczy-bind in this position. Yeah, and if you want to, like, you know, try to find it yourself, you can, but it's kind of difficult, honestly. And if you don't have like concrete analysis, you might get into a much worse position as black. So yeah, let's see. Like, there are a bunch of moves that black can play. They can play like rook ac8, they can play rook fc8, they can play pawn to a6 here, you know, flexible move. They can play pawn to e6. Let's look at e6 first. And you know, at some point maybe black wants to try to play d5, but now we play queen d2, you know, anticipating that black is trying to push d5. So we put our queen in the center, not queen e2, remember? Instead, rook fd8 is possible, rook ad1, and black has white is under the d5 square under a lot of control. So here playing pawn to d5 is the most popular move, but it's not really good. After cd5, ed5, we have this typical move of knight takes e6, forcing bc6, and then pawn to e5. And in general, if we're able to play them with pawn to e5 here, and then follow it up with f4, then we're able to shut down the enemy bishop. So for example, knight e8 and a pawn to f4. And white has really nice grip over the dark squares in the position. The pawn on c6 is a weakness. White can play knight e4 to c5, you know, slowly build on the position, bishop d4. If you want to look at, you know, similar structures here, or like learn how to kind of play in this kind of position against this kind of the weaknesses on the dark squares, you should look at the very famous game Rubinstein versus Salwe in Lodz 1908. There was a game that continued in this fashion, where essentially the grip on the dark squares became like too much to handle, and white got a really nice position. So yeah, that's a simple coverage of e6. Instead, let's see the move rook ac8. So yeah, it doesn't really, maybe the idea is, the rook is like kind of not useful in a8. Some people might say that the rook is useful in a8 in case like, black is managing to sacrifice a pawn with a6 and b5 even, because at least the rook is going to be on the open file. But if black decides that maybe they don't want to go for that plan and go rook ac8, then we can first up play pawn to b3, defend the c4 pawn because it's under pressure. We can play rook b3, rook fd8, queen d2, pawn to e6, and the rook at d1. And still, the d5 break is still controlled. So I think that a better move is to try to play, earlier on, is to play rook fc8 instead of rook ac8. And there are actually some really concrete reasons why rook fc8 is better. So yeah, rook fc8 here, we still play b3, defending the b4, the c4 pawn. If black plays a6 here, then I think I like the move a4 here. And the thing is that we're really controlling the b5 square, and I'm not saying that this is a try for an advantage, but I mean, it is a try for an advantage, but I don't think, objectively, white is managing to successfully do so. I think it's just a really nice move that just, let's say after a6, is managing to prevent black's counterplay, and is quite a nice move, strategically speaking. And for example, the thing is that if you play the move queen d3, which we'll see later in the main line, then black has the move knight e5, let's say queen d2, and then pawn to b5 here. And this is the line that actually equalizes for black, is after c takes b4, black can play the move d5 here. And I first saw, this solution that MVL played actually against Caruana, and he managed to equalize quite easily here. And yeah, this is why I call this the MVL line. It's very strange that like pawn to b5 followed by d5 immediately, sacrificing a pawn, just like works so well for black, and this is equalizing fully. But yeah, instead, so I want to avoid that, and so if possible, I want to play the move a4, and we at least get a game. Queen d8, rook b1, getting off the long diagonal, queen a5, queen d2, knight d7, and knight d to e2, avoiding the exchange of pieces, and we get a typical slight edge kind of position for white. You kind of need to know what to do in this position. I'm thinking maybe moves like king h1. You can consider rook fd1 if necessary. Otherwise, f4 followed by either knight d5 here, or even f4 followed by maybe f5 is a reasonable way to play. So yeah, that's possible, and just a way to get a game. Instead, if they don't play a6, they can also play queen d8 here, which is the main move, trying to play the move queen a5. So now we play queen d2, defending our knight and connecting our rooks. If black plays a6 here, then I like this thematic move actually to play the move knight c6, which is probably not recommended by a lot of people. But the point is that after bc6, the move knight e4 here becomes a real problem, and we just have a really nice grip over the dark squares here. Even after knight d7, rook fd1, or rook ad1, black doesn't solve all of the problems in their position. Yeah, it's just optically it looks really like a really nice position because we have a lot of control over the queenside squares. So instead of that, rook c6 is possible, but I really like white's position after, let's say, rook ad1, and maybe continue with a4 and knight d5 next. And at the end of the day, black isn't getting in the break with pawn to d5 or pawn to b5. So I like white's position. Instead, queen a5 immediately is possible, but now we play rook fd1. It's possible to do it this way because, rook ad1 is also possible, but in this specific position, I like rook fd1. The point is that the rook on a1 later can go to b1 to maybe defend the b3 pawn. Let's say a6, and now we want to prevent b5 as per usual, so we play a4. And now knight d7 is possible, preparing knight c5. And now we want to, because there's a threat of like trading all of the pieces here on d4, we kind of have to like avoid that if we want to still fight for an advantage. So knight d to e2, and we just secure the knights, prepare rook b8 to b1 next, and as long as black isn't able to push d5 or d5, I think white has an advantage here, be it slight. So Yeah, that's the move rook f8. So instead, let's look at the most popular move a6 here. And here, it's important to know that why this setup is chosen, right? Why do we play, and also like what to choose for our next move. And so in this position, if we play the move queen e2, which is generally desirable because we want to play, rook fd1, we want to control the b5 square with the queen on this diagonal. But then it runs to attack with knight takes e4, which wins a pawn here. So that's the reason that the next move is possibly best, which is the move queen d3. Now, from this position still, this becomes like a big, position where black has a lot of options, big tabia. And so in this position, like rook a to c8 is possible, rook f c8 is possible, rook a to b8 followed by b5 is possible. But I think the most direct way is to play the move rook fc8. That is, I think, the cleanest equalizer. So if you're playing this from the black side, at least you know something about that. So rook a8 is possible, threatening knight e5 immediately, but we'll play the move pawn to b3, knight e5, and the queen d2 here. And we have a lot of control over the b5 and d5 squares still. And yeah, it's not really possible to sacrifice a pawn with pawn to b5. So we'll just play, rook ac1, rook fd1, and just get a nice position. At some point playing knight d5. Instead, rook ab8 is possible. But I think I like the move knight c6 here in this kind of position. The pawn is again bc6, runs into a move like knight e4 here, or b3 followed by knight e4. And still, there are some problems on the dark squares on the queen side here, which gives white a nice grip. Instead, if you play, queen takes c6, I think the move a4 here makes a lot of sense, just preventing pawn to b5. And we play pawn to b3 next, rook fd1, rook ac1, and still prevent all of black's breaks. Instead of that, the most challenging move is rook fc8. So yeah, let's cover this move actually first. And the thing is that black is immediately threatening knight e5, attacking the queen and the pawn on c4. And so white should play the move pawn to b3 here. And the thing is that black can immediately play pawn to b5. And after c takes b5, they go for knight e5, the most forcing line, attacking the queen. Queen comes back to d2, we still need to defend the knight, and now pawn to d5. And this is the main point. If we take on d5 with the pawn, then black is able to play the move rook takes c3, queen takes c3, and knight takes d5 with a fork. And after we come back, takes, there's at least the move knight c4 here, which attacks the knight on d4, and it's going to be, winning our queen very soon. So instead of that, if we play the move, it's also possible to play knight c6 here, but it doesn't really, doesn't really give white the advantage either. Instead, knight takes d5 is what I recommend, and this is played a few times by top players like Caruana and Sean, and it does equalize, but black needs to know what they're doing because they are going to be down a pawn still. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, and now a takes b5 here is important. If you take on d5 with the queen first, then after b takes a6 and rook takes a6, it looks like black has typical Benko Gambit, type of competition on the a and b files, but white plays a4 here and is ready to actually play the move rook a to d1, followed by moving the queen away from the e file and then playing a move like knight d5 here. And the pawns on the queen side are actually quite dangerous, so black doesn't manage to equalize here. Let's say queen b7, rook a to d1, rook to d6 here, pinning the knight, queen to e2, queen to b4, and now knight b5 here, forcing the trade of rooks. And now here white has simple play with like h3, rook f2 to d2, try to activate the rook, and even though these pawns are blockaded right now, it's clear that white has at least a slight advantage here. Yeah, and here the best move is to play a takes b5, and black is still down a pawn here, but after rook a d1, queen takes d5, they are managing to win back the pawn, but we have this nice move queen e2, attacking the b5 pawn, forcing black to actually find the next move, knight c6. And here we play the move knight takes b5. So in this position, it's a bit different because, yeah, after the move queen e6 here, black is managing to actually, put pressure on the b3 pawn, preventing us from playing a4, and also ideas of maybe playing bishop h6 to try to off some pieces. But in general, black's pieces are quite active. They can later continue with a move like knight b4, try to attack the a2 pawn. And so here, I recommend the line with rook d2, knight b4, and then rook e1 here, just defending the queen further. Rook d2 defends the a pawn, h5 is possible, and we can see how this game continued between Caruana and MVL, which continued knight d4, queen e6, queen takes, and pawn to a4, rook to c3, bishop to f2, knight to d3, rook e to d1, and then eventually we get this position where we liquidate into an equal game. But, you know, at least it's asking black some questions. Like early on, there were some traps to avoid, there's some traps to avoid. Like if they don't know this line, then they're going to be in a bit of trouble. And even if they manage to enter this line, then they're still going to be down a pawn until like move 20. So, I mean, even beyond move 20. So, yeah, black needs to play very accurately to actually know this. And so, yeah, that's the line that I recommend. Although I do need to admit that it does objectively equalize. Instead, knight to e5 here is like the main move. Yeah, I believe it's the main move. But after queen e2, I really like white's position here. It's because they get the queen to e2 instead of d2. And let's say after rook a c8, white plays b3. And the idea that black is going for this is they play b5, taking advantage of the knight on c3. But here, we have the very typical and very timely response of knight d5. Now there's a threat of knight b6 here with the fork, so knight to d5 is forced. But after cd5, white gets a really nice structure here because black is at some point eventually going to have to play the move pawn to e6 to kind of like, you know, undermine white's center. Otherwise, they're just going to be much worse, structurally speaking. For example, they can play a move like queen b7 here, trying to give space for the knight on d7. But after rook a c1, you know, white fights for control over the c file with an edge. White can simply play like, you know, king h1 very slowly, play h3 followed by f4, and then stick a knight on c6 here. So at least that's something white can play for. Instead, pawn to e6 here is like the most forcing move. And after d takes e6, fe6, black has a permanently weak structure with the pawn on e6 and d6. And I think that white can just slowly put some pressure here. So, you know, against like a computer, like they will definitely defend this correctly. However, I think against a human, it's a much different story because they are, at least strategically, it's quite a dangerous position. So here, rook ad1, putting pressure on the d file, knight c6, and now the move queen f2 is quite nice. This is originally recommended by, again, Arthur Nixons, one of the, you know, a very big opening theoretician, Latvian grandmaster. I really like his recommendations, and this queen f2 move is really strong. And after rook fd8, white can play the move h4, just introducing more ideas of the attack into the position, more elements. And yeah, black's best move here is to play d5, and this is like the move that was played most in correspondence, which is why it's the most critical. So e takes d5 here, queen takes d5, and then the move knight e2. And taking on d1 here doesn't really equalize for black because they are they are still accepting a structural weakness with the pawn on e6 here. So white can still go after it and target it with, you know, moves like knight f4 and stuff. So instead, queen e5 is the best move, but now we play knight g3 and just, you know, preparing to occupy maybe the e4 square. After knight d4, knight to e4, knight f5. In this position, rook takes d8, rook takes e8, and bishop c5. Yeah, again, a draw was agreed here in a correspondence game, but it's clear that white has the slight edge in this kind of position in general because they have moves like h5 here, even at the cost of a pawn. You know, if the circumstance is right, you know, moves like rook e1, knight g5, and still, you know, black is kind of struggling from a human perspective. So I would be quite happy to enter this position as white. So yeah, that covers essentially this move, bishop d7, which is the first part in this series. Yeah, recommending lines for white against the Moscow. And the next video, we're going to be looking at the move knight d7, and then lastly, we're going to be looking at knight c6, which is the least critical of the three lines. Okay, so the second move is this move knight d7. So after we get the main position of the Moscow, knight d7, in this position, there are a lot of moves that white can choose. One interesting line is this move pawn to c4, aiming for a Maroczy bind. But in general, I think that if we try to go for the Maroczy bind idea with knight f6, let's say knight c3, defending the pawn, g6, castles, bishop g7, and now pawn to d4, I don't think this is as good because our bishop on b5 is kind of misplaced, as oftentimes black will be able to play the move a6, forcing our bishop to either capture on d7 or drop the bishop back to a4 for, let's say, for example, castles. Here, bishop takes c7 makes some sense because otherwise, if we play a move like bishop a4, trying to preserve our bishop, black can play the move knight b6, forcing us to defend the b3 pawn, c4 pawn with bishop b3, and our bishop is quite passive on the square. Let's say, for example, knight fd7 followed by knight c5 gives black a very good position. So instead, if we take on d7 here, we can possibly enter this position getting like a Maroczy bind, but then again, black has the bishop here, and yeah, it is something that we need to be careful playing with. though it is definitely possible. So instead of that, an interesting line to investigate is this move pawn to d3, with the idea that you're not exactly entering like a Maroczy bind, but actually you're entering more like a close Sicilian kind of position with the pawn on c4. And we can have ideas of future, in the future playing like bishop a4 coming back to c2, just making sure we don't lose the bishop here. Playing a3, rook b1 followed by b4, and white remains flexible with the center here. Let's say maybe we can play h3, we can play bishop e3, queen d2, and just play the position, with a slight space advantage here. So that's a definitely possible line of play. But instead, I want to recommend this move pawn to c3, which is kind of an old line that is known to be fine for black, but I think for people under 2200, I think this is a very decent way to play. The idea is very simple, it's very straightforward, it's very logical. You simply want to play pawn to d4, and you're also giving the bishop square on c2 to retreat to. For example, if black plays a6, then we can drop the bishop back to a4. Let's say b5, bishop c2, bishop e7, castles, knight gf6. And in this position, I like the move queen e2, with the idea of pushing d4 next, and we're keeping this rook flexible, so you can go to e1 or even d1 if needed. So yeah, that's possible, and this will transpose to the main line. But after knight f6 here, which is the main move, there are two lines that I wanted to possibly recommend, which is this move bishop d3, which is quite a relatively, okay, maybe not a new move, but it was popular back in like 2019 to 2020, with the idea that the bishop is coming back to c2 and then pushing pawn to d4. And so even though we waste time, putting the bishop to b5 and then back to d3 and then back to c2, the black knight is misplaced on d7. So we can say that we kind of provoked this knight on d7, and wasting that much time with the bishop is an important factor, but it doesn't matter as much as one would originally think. But instead, I like this move queen e2 as well. This is the old line, and the point is that we support the e4 pawn. We now have possibilities of playing rook d1 after we castle, and we again want to play pawn to d4. So from this position, black has a couple of setups they can go for. They can go for this move e5, which I think is kind of inaccurate because white can immediately strike in the center with d4. So black is arguing that their pawns in the center are kind of like fighting for space, but after pawn to d4, we realize that let's say they play a move like a6 here, kicking our bishop away. Now we'll actually take on d7. And if they take with the knight, let's say, just defending their center, we can see that black's coordination is quite bad here. Well, what is the knight doing on d7? We can simply castle next. Let's say castles, b5 and a4, and black is under significant pressure here, and I think white is already quite a bit better. Instead, if they play queen takes d7, trying to sacrifice the pawn on e5, here we can take it, let's say to e5, and because knight takes e5 maybe runs into like queen e6, where we lose our e4 pawn, we can castle first. And in general, I think that, yeah, white is just doing very well. Let's say knight bishop d6, we have a very typical idea here, because this knight on b1 isn't exactly amazing. Even if it goes to like d2 to c4, it doesn't really do much. So instead, we play this move pawn to c4, the very typical move in this variation, where we bring the knight out to c3, where it can occupy the central d5 square. This bishop on d6 is also bad. We can play moves like rook d1, pawn to h3, and with this big space advantage and better piece activity. Instead, if they play bishop e7, now I think we can grab the e5 pawn, let's say queen e6, bishop f4, and any bishop d6 can always be responded with knight d3, so that is quite a nice position. Instead, black and castle, we play rook e1, defending the e-pawn, b5, and now since black plays this move pawn to b5, we can respond with the typical pawn to a4, attacking the queenside structure. Let's say bishop b7, knight d2, and after, let's say queen b6, takes. One idea for black to play is to move pawn to c4 so that they free up the c5 square for the bishop, but here we can play a c4 ourselves, preventing the queenside pawn advancement, and we're doing much better in this position. So that's possible, but clearly black has an edge there. Instead, let's say after in this position, black can also go for g6 setup. But in general, if as I mentioned many times before in my coverage of the Moscow, if black ever plays pawn to g6 here, they need to be really careful, because white, if they're able to push d4 immediately, like c3 and d4 in one go, then I think that this g6 setup isn't really good, because after we play pawn to d4, not only does our bishop have the d3 square to go back to,
we're also immediately threatening the advance of e5. Let's say bishop g7, we have the move e5. After d takes, knight d5, we can play pawn to e6, just breaking the pawn structure, f takes e6, now knight g5. Very typical move, attacking the e6 pawn. Let's say knight c7, we can play bishop f4 now. This is very nice. We're threatening now bishop takes e7, followed by knight takes e6. And if black takes on e5 on b5 now, then it fails to knight takes e6 with a decisive fork. So instead of that, pawn to e5 is best, but now we can play bishop takes e5, making use of this fact that this bishop, this knight is under a pin. And now we exchange the director of bishops, which is a very good position. Yeah, results in a very good position. But, black is forced to castle here, but now we can play bishop c4. E6 is kind of forced because there's no other move. And now we can play queen g3, a very nice move. And yeah, we can simply continue with like knight d2, continue with the deadly attack with h4, h5. And yeah, basically we don't need to castle unless, unless our king is under any danger. So I think the white king is actually quite safe here, since black is very far from completing development. So this is a very nice position, obviously. Instead of bishop g7, obviously they should maybe play a move like a6, but now we have the square on d3 to go back to, and this is basically a good version of the main lines because we get the bishop to d3 in one go, and so yeah, very early on I think it would be better for black to play a6 first. Let's say instead of g6 they play a6 first. So now if we drop the bishop back to d3, or if we drop the bishop back to a4, then we're not gonna be able to play d4 like as fast as we would like to. But instead of a6 first, we should look at the move pawn to e6 here, getting a very solid pawn center. But after we play pawn to d4, the problem is that black is not able to go for their typical equalizing maneuver, which is c takes d4, cd4, and d5. Now this is thematic, but the problem is that this is very different. After e5 and knight e4, this is a typical idea, but because the knight is on d7 compared to the possibility of going on c6, black has not managed to equalize here. Let's say castles, bishop e7, knight bd2, we exchange black's best piece, we take, bishop takes d2, castles, and now bishop d3. Now we can see the difference is that the knight is on d7. So if black wants to go with the, improve the knight's position, they're gonna have to go back to b8 and then c6, wasting 2 tempi. And then now we can even continue with, moves like rook c1, bishop b1, queen d3, setting up a battery, maybe ideas of h4, h5. And yeah, even at the cost of a pawn, maybe that's even playable. But in general, yeah, because of black's lagging development, this idea of actually, allowing this structure, which should normally be okay for black, is not very good for black anymore. So that's important to understand. So basically the move pawn to e6 is not very great. In case they play pawn to e6 followed by a6, we can now drop the bishop back to d3. And let's say they play pawn to b5, we can actually strike. We can see that this pawn advancement on the queen side is actually very unstable, especially when they do it before they're, before black is ready to castle. So we can play pawn to a4, let's say bishop b7, counter-attacking e4, and now we can play the move castle here and just get a very nice position here with a lot of pressure on the queen side and even in the center. Instead, if they play bishop e7, we can again play a4, now even preventing pawn to b5, and just get a very nice position, a very nice grip over the position. We can just castle, knight d2, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, and this knight on d7 is simply misplaced, so I think white is in general doing quite well in these lines. So let's look at the main move a6 here. So it's important for black to get a tempo on the bishop first, because now we have to either drop the bishop back to d3 or a4. I like the move bishop a4 because at least we're able to drop back to c2, so that our deep pawn is not blockaded. Because we want to push pawn to d4. And in this position, there are a lot of moves again. Black can play a move like queen c7, discouraging d4, and also going for maybe an independent idea, which is after castle, is to go for this idea of c4, which is quite rare. But the idea is that they're preventing the d4 advance because now they can take en passant and ruin our center. So now we'll play bishop c2, prophylaxis against maybe knight c5, and also pawn to b5. And now black typically plays the move e5. Now at first glance, this looks very solid, increasing the central control, but after e5 and we play pawn to a4, we're preventing the b5 advance entirely, and after, let's say, queen c6, preparing b5 maybe at some point, here we can actually play knight a3 and targeting the c4 pawn. So we see that if they don't play queen c6 now, after knight a3, the c4 pawn is very weak, and black would not be able to play b5 because we can take twice. hitting the queen with tempo. So that's the point of queen c6. After knight e3, they can play b5 now. But after we take, we can actually play pawn to d3 here, undermining these this pawn chain. And we suddenly realize that, yeah, after if they take on d3, then we can play bishop takes d3, hitting b5. And so bishop b7 here tries to counterattack. But now we can develop with bishop g5, putting a lot of pressure. Knight b6, which is the best move, rook fd1, increasing the d-file pressure, bishop e7, and now it's perfectly timed to take on c4, bc4, take on f6, bishop f6, and now even put more pressure on the c4 pawn with knight d2. And simply the c4 pawn is gonna drop, or if you play a move like bishop a6, you're really, your development is really lacking here. The bishop only has one purpose on a6, which is to defend the c4 pawn. So yeah, in general, black is doing quite well there. Instead of e5 here, b5 is also possible, but this is premature because it allows our typical advance of pawn to a4 here. And let's say after bishop e7, we can even play maybe pawn to d3, or yeah, we can take on b5 here, trade off the rooks, and then play the move knight e3 here, hitting the b5 pawn. Let's say queen b7, and now knight d4. The b5 pawn is now dropping, and the c4 pawn also becomes weak as a result. So yeah, we just have a very nice position as in case of queen c7. In case of g6, again, here it's the important thing to know is that there is a bit of move order trickery, because in general, again, as I mentioned before, if black chooses g6 setup, if we're able to play c3 and d4 in one go, I think we're doing quite well. But if we play d4 in this position, this is inaccurate, because here black has the move queen a5, which is quite annoying, pinning the c3 pawn and attacking the bishop on a4, so that now after the bishop comes back, black can take on d4. And the point is that we cannot take back with the c pawn, meaning that we have to play knight takes d4, and black gets a very good position actually. So instead of that, we castle first, and after bishop g7, only now we play d4. Let's say b5 and bishop c2, where we simply get a very nice position here. Yeah, instead of that, after bishop a4, yeah, black can also play e5, but now this would be play d4, transposing to the line earlier. And so the best move here is to play pawn to b5, forcing the bishop to come back to c2. And now, again, there are many moves. If black plays a move pawn to c4, preventing our d4 advance, then I think we can play the move pawn to b3. And the problem is that without the moves like bishop b7, black is not able to play the move rook c8 and queen c7 in time to defend the c4 pawn. So if they take with the, on b3 here, then we can simply take back with the a pawn, opening up the a file with a nice position. Pawn to d4 is next. And if they play a move like, queen c7, we're always ready to take on c4. Let's say bc4, knight a3. Something like this, attacking c4 is quite nice. And black, and ideally if they have the move bishop e7 and they're able to play a move like rook c8, they're gonna be fine. But in this position, if they're forced to play knight b6, then I think that white is essentially, managed to, get a success out of this opening, because this knight on b6 is generally not great. So yeah, that's what happens after c4. In case of g6, again, we play pawn to d4. And in this position, if they play bishop g7, again, remember, we're aiming for e5. Takes, knight e5. And now, objectively best is here to play the move a4. We can also play pawn to e6, and this is enough for an advantage. Let's say fe6 and knight e2 with a nice position. But instead, a4 here is objectively best. The point is after, let's say, rook b8, we can castle, pawn to e6, take on b5, and go knight a3, where instead of playing in the center with this pawn on e5, advancing to e6, we're actually targeting the pawn on b5. Let's say c4, we can actually now occupy the d4 square with the knight, threatening knight c6 and also taking the pawn on b5. So let's say bishop e5, knight a takes b5, castles, and queen c4, where we're simply going to be a pawn up here, and we can, still improve the position. Rook d1 maybe, bishop e4 comes back to f3, improving the bishop on the long diagonal, and just get a, a pawn up position. Very nice. But of course, pawn to e6 earlier on in this position instead of a4 is perfectly playable and also good. So instead of bishop e7, taking down d4 immediately is possible, but after releasing the tension, simply white has a nice position because they have a static advantage of the two pawns in the center. Let's say knight b6 here, which is the most played move. We can play bishop g5, and now white has a clear advantage here because the bishop on g7 is not going to be great because of our pawn on d4. We can continue with the castles, h3 preventing bishop g4, knight bd2, and then eventually pawn to b3 to prevent knight c4 here, and then we can also play rook ac1. Just get a very nice position with the with a nice center, very static advantage, quite nice. And so we see that, yeah, the entire time is that the problem is that in black position is that the knight on d7 is kind of like quite a passive piece and quite bad compared to the knight on c6. So g6 doesn't really work. E6 here is possible, but we go for d4, and this can easily transpose into the main line after bishop e7, d4, and then e6. So we'll cover that later. Instead, e5 is possible, but now we play d4. Very typical move. Let's say they play bishop e7. We can now even play d5 here and just get a nice, basically like a nice version of like Spanish here with the bishop on b7. We enter basically a very similar structure to like the Chigorin. If you know that from the Ruy Lopez, but we know that in the Chigorin, the bishop on b7 is quite a bad piece. So once black has committed the bishop to b7, we can immediately close it up and we get a very nice position. So understanding the Ruy Lopez very well is also a very big plus in playing this system. And let's say if they play bishop e7, now we can still go for d5. And white is doing very well because of a lot of reasons. For example, they can play pawn to b3 and c4 to support the queen side, getting a lot of space. And as a result, black cannot play the free move c5 to c4. This knight on d7 is also quite passive, and the bishop later on b7 doesn't stand very well. So for all these reasons, white is doing much better. At least we can see from a human perspective, it's very unpleasant to play from the black side. So instead of pawn to e5 here, bishop b7 is the main move, putting some pressure on e4. Now we play pawn to d4. So now here, a typical mistake that I think a lot of lower rated people play is this move c takes d4, because they give up the center and they're allowing our knight to go to c3 immediately. After rook c8 here, the point is that if we play knight c3, maybe black pushes pawn to b4. But now here, after castles, black may have the idea of actually sacrificing the rook on c2 here. After queen takes c2, is to play the bishop takes e4. And after queen e2 and bishop e7, just safeguarding the bishop. It seems like black has, decent compensation with the bishop on the long diagonal, but white is able to get an advantage with the following sequence. With the very counterintuitive move bishop d2, first off. Now the point is to play a4, but we don't want to allow the possible advance of pawn to b4. And so after this move, I think that white has a very serious chance for an advantage here, because after pawn to a4, the queen side structure will be weakened. So bishop d2 is a very important move to know, but I think white should be doing quite well there. Instead of that, if queen c7 here, trying to put some pressure on the bishop, we can simply improve the bishop's position with bishop d3, maybe strike with a4 next, and just get still some nice static advantages with the pawns in the center. So instead of c takes d4, e5 again is possible, challenging our center, but now we can either play de5 and rook d1, or we can play d5 immediately. So now I like this move again because the bishop on b7 is shut down in this very typical Ruy Lopez position. And so if they play c4 now, we can actually play pawn to b3. If they take on b3, we're very happy, a b3. And we have just, long-term advantage. Castles, pawn to c4, maybe bishop comes to d2. Maybe you can, go to a5 later on. And yeah, just the bishop on b7 is just struggling, as well as the knight on d7. So instead, rook c8 is possible. This was played by Kosteniuk against Anna Oshinina in 2014. In Blitz. But after bc4, the problem is that this is an improvement, which is over the game, because if bc4, then we can play knight a3, hitting the c4 pawn, and also the bishop on b7 just becomes stuck. Let's say queen c7, castles, bishop e7, and now rook b1, castles, rook d1. And we see that white has continuously, some ways to improve. Let's say h3, we can develop the bishop g5, or if black ever plays g6, then we can always play bishop h6. And just the pawn on c4 becomes weak. We can improve the nice position later, knight d2 to f1, and then maybe g3, so that it can go to f5. That's one possibility. And you see with all these arrows, like there are just like a lot of ideas here for white. So yeah, that's possible. Instead of rook takes c4, we can now play a4, just undermining the pawns. We can, very soon play castles, followed by a takes b5, and then knight d2 maybe. And just, the b5 pawn becomes a significant weakness, just long term. So c4 is not possible. Instead of bishop e7, now b3, castles, rook e8, And now, instead of pawn to c4, I also like to move a4 here, challenging the queen side. After b4, this looks very natural, because if we play pawn to c4, then black is going to get the position very close with a5. So instead, we play a5 ourselves, taking away the b6 square for the knight, you know, which isn't a great square for the knight, but at least it's better than on d7. But in this position, yeah, simply it's very miserable, because black's development is very, you know, black's pieces are all like basically on the first 3 ranks. Yeah, they have a lack of space. Black can maybe play some like queen c8, bishop d8, bishop c7, queen d8 to try to win the a5 pawn, but we see that this is like the only way to take advantage of the weakness on a5. But because that's like a very long plan, I don't think it's very realistic. And so in the meantime, white can play the move like knight fd2, take advantage of the c4 square, and just basically squeeze black here. It's a very difficult position to play. So instead of pawn to e5 here, which is I think could be very common, g6 again does allow the move pawn to e5, but with the bishop on the long diagonal, I think this is less good, because now black has the move bishop takes f3, and this is kind of unpleasant, because if we play queen takes f3, then the pawn e5 is hanging, and if we play gf3, then simply our pawns are going to be doubled. So even if we get in the move e6, our structure is also weakened here. So instead of that, we just simply castle, bishop g7, and now after here, we can play either like rook e1 or knight d2 in this position. I like either move. Why not knight d2 to prepare e5 next? Let's say castle and then pawn to e5, or even rook e1. I think it's very playable. I'm just going for a yeah, very slow and stable advantage here. If we don't play e5, then at least we're not opening up the light squared bishop for black. So yeah, this looks quite healthy and quite nice. Instead, pawn to e6 is the main move, just fighting for the center and preventing any possible e5 and e6 advances from white. This is the most, yeah, this is the least complicated move, and I think very solid. It's not difficult for black to find these moves either, but there are a lot of traps along the way, as we saw. We can castle here, bishop e7, and in this position, I like the move rook d1, which threatens the possibility of d takes e5. And then later, after we play this move, we can play a4, trying to undermine the queen side. So here, if black castles, then we can play a4 immediately. If they play b4, challenging our queen side, we can actually play e5. If now they take on f3, with bishop takes f3, we can play gf3. And the point is that with the rook on d1, this is quite a big improvement from the position before. Because now they cannot, okay, like, they can play knight d5, but now we kick away the knight with c4, knight c7, and now a move like queen d3, threatening h7 here, forcing black to make a concession, and white should be much better in this kind of position. There is the possibility of even e takes d6, bishop takes d6, and dc5, possibly winning even a piece if we're careful. Instead, if black plays the immediate knight d5, okay, I think we can immediately play c4. Let's see, is there a better move? I think we can even play e takes d6, bishop d6, dc5. Yeah, no matter what, with what black takes on c5 here, let's say bishop c5. Yeah, maybe pawn to c4 immediately is, yeah, quite nice. But even then, like, if they play knight takes here, we have pawn to c4, and there's some issues. Yeah, so I think this is quite nice. Maybe on bishop c5, I'm wondering there's a move like queen e4 or queen d3, followed by pawn to c4. Maybe knight 7 to f6 is okay. But yeah, in general, like, if we look at the position, there are like 2 bishops aiming at the black king, and the alignment of pieces on the d file isn't exactly amazing. But yeah, there are some details to be worked out here, admittedly. Instead of pawn to b4 here, queen c7 is possible, which is a solid move. We cannot take on b5 here because later on our e4 pawn is going to hang. So here I like the move bishop g5. You know, the bishop has to go somewhere. So before black plays pawn to h6, we can develop our bishop to g5. And after h6, I think that giving up the bishop is possible, but bishop h4, just maintaining the bishops, you know, going bishop g3 maybe in the future if the bishop is kicked away. And, you know, I just like, in general, I just like having the bishops, the static advantage of having the pawn centered. If black ever plays rook f8, we can always play a move like bishop d3, improving the bishop's position, making sure it's not weak, and also hitting the b5 pawn. And pawn to c4 would be a strategic plus for white, because at the end of the day, we are, you know, there is no more tension on the center, and so our center is quite stable, quite nice. So instead of queen c7 here, after castles, they can also play queen c7 immediately, but now we play a4, typical move, challenging the queen side. After castles and now bishop g5 again, we go and we transpose actually to the line before. Let's say h6, bishop h4. Now, if they ever play e5, then d5 is I think the best move, but we can even consider a move like pawn to d5 here, saying that now we get a better version of the Jagoran because it's not, this bishop 1b7 is quite a bad piece. Instead of that though, after pawn to e5, d5, if they take on e5 with the knight, then after the exchange of pieces, we can actually play knight e3 here and hit the b5 pawn. So there are some issues here. Let's say pawn to b4. We don't want to take on b4 because that would open up the c file. But instead we play knight c4. And we just get a very nice grip on the position. Yeah, like we have the moves like ideas of like pawn to a5. We can target the e5 pawn with like bishop g3. And even if they take on c3 and give us this weakness, this pawn is actually quite nice defending a lot of squares in the center, while black does not have that luxury. So instead of that, c4 is possible, but now we take on b5, ab5, bishop takes f6 is important, removing an attacker of the e4 pawn before we take on b5. After queen c5, this gets a bit complicated, but after takes, and knight d6, the knight is very active in threatening the bishop, so bishop a6. And now we have an improvement over this game that was seen once, which is move bishop a4, which is a very nice move. Where the idea is, it's very concrete, but the point is that we want to meet rook d8 with the move knight e8. Yeah, and the point is that we're still up a pawn in this position, but if we're able to exchange off some pieces, then the bishop here, yeah, will, it still matters in the position, but if we're able to trade it off, at least we the power of the bishop here and black's attacking chances will be much more reduced. So yeah, that's quite a nice and interesting idea. But the point is that, we're up a pawn and we should be quite happy there. If d5 here in this position, now we can play the move knight e3. And okay, like we can also play pawn to c4 in this position. But yeah, like once black plays pawn to b4, we don't really get the idea of playing knight c3 to d5 anymore. So I don't really love this approach. Instead, I like the move knight a3, just hitting the b5 pawn. One of the typical ideas, again, b4, knight c4. Is good for white. This pawn on a6 is also becoming a long-term weakness. So c4 here is interesting, trying to sacrifice the pawn because the b2 pawn also becomes weak. But after the sequence ab5 and ab5, we can take the pawn on b5, queen b6 with some pressure on b2. But now we can take the pawn on c4. And it seems like black is getting interesting compensation after bishop a6. But now we have the beautiful move rook a6. After queen takes a6 here, we can play the move queen e2 back. And yeah, if we're smart about it, then white can't advance the pawns on the queen side here. But we have a very simple plan of like maybe playing bishop d3, rook b1, and trying to advance these pawns eventually at some point. So yeah, very nice position at the cost of an exchange. We have two pawns and the bishop pair. So instead rook takes a1 is best. After rook a1, bishop a6. Now I think that this line equalizes, but we have to play like move like bishop a4, g5, bishop g3, rook b8, and now bishop b3, threatening the f7 pawn. And after rook f8, we come back with the bishop to a4, and we finally get a repetition here, which unfortunately is, I think, the best line of play. But, like this is one of the most forcing equalizing lines. But if black doesn't know this, then they're going to be in some serious trouble. So I personally wouldn't mind, knowing that there are a lot of tricks and traps that black has to not fall into. For example, they need to know this idea of sacrificing the b5 pawn and later going for rook takes a1 followed by bishop a6 and not the other way around, playing bishop a6 immediately. So yeah, it's like there's some questions to be asked, but yeah, even though black is able to equalize in one critical line, it is I don't think that it's very common or has been seen in practice before. So yeah, instead of e5 immediately, c takes d4 is possible, but yeah, in general, I like the fact that white has two pawns in the center. Rook fc8, putting some pressure on the bishop, bishop d3, and here, b4 is a move that I think a lot of people would want to play, with the point that you're not allowing knight c3. But in this position, the thematic a5 actually gives white a nice advantage because we can eventually go with knight d2. Knight can come to b3 or c4. I think on b3 it's more stable. On c4, it can also maybe aim at the b6 square. Maybe try to advance pawn to e5 and fighting for some dark squares. That's also possible. But instead, b takes a4 is actually the best move. And Yeah, it's very counterintuitive because you do give up the center, but the point is that after rook takes a4, yeah, like in this position, the computer assesses this as equal. However, if we look at the position like from a human perspective, white has very something, something serious to play for, which is this weakness on a6. So white has a c3 square for the knight can come to c3, white can improve the position, like, giving the king some loop with h3, and we can eventually put some pressure on the a6 pawn. And I think that this is objectively equal because there are like dynamic chances for both sides. But it's with the clear structural disadvantage that black has. I think this is quite nice for white, especially from a positional player's perspective, where you're not aiming for a huge advantage, but you just want a tiny one that you can play for, in the long term. So yeah, this concludes the coverage of this move 97 on the third move, and I hope you see that even though there are like 2 to 3 positions that are considered to be equal according to modern theory and analysis, we can clearly see that it's not as easy or as trivial as the computer makes it out to be. Because in this position, for example, the computer says that this is equal because of the dynamic chances, but white has the c3 square for the knight, the pawn on a6 is weak, and we can just continue putting pressure on it, and black needs to be very accurate still to hold this position. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this coverage of 97. Let's move on to 96. Okay, and in this last part, we're going to be looking at the move 96. So after we get to the main position, bishop b5 and 96 here. Now, the point of 96 is to control the center, right? But the problem is that, with this 96 move, it's just walking right into a pin. So it doesn't really prevent white from pushing c3 and d4 really quickly. Now, first off, I think it's important to actually castle first. Yeah, and another point is that after castles, the problem is that black can't really develop like they would like to. For example, if they play a move like knight f6 here, white can play the move e5. And after, let's say, d takes e, knight takes e5, eventually we'll take on c6 and just double the black pawns. For example, queen c7, attacking the knight. So now bishop c6, so that our knight stays on the e5, b takes e6, and rook e1, just supporting it. Bishop f5 makes sense, and now we can block off this diagonal with d3, pawn to e6, and now queen to f3 here, hitting the c6 pawn, forcing rook c8, which is just another unpleasant move you don't want to really play. And now bishop f4, putting some pressure on the queen, bishop d6, and now white can play knight d2, followed by knight c4. And we can see that the position is really easy for white to play. White, has all the advantages in the position, and black doesn't have enough compensation for these double pawns. So instead of that, the main move is the move bishop d7. It's because you want to parry the threat of bishop takes c6 at any point, right? And the problem is that if black ever pushes the pawn, the pawn to e5 in this kind of position, you can really push c3 and d4 quickly. And so, yeah, black isn't ready to kind of do that. So bishop d7 is the main move, just defending the knight. And now I like the move rook e1. And the point is that in general, if we can bring the bishop back to f1 in response to a6, I think we're going to be doing very well because we get to regroup our pieces and make sure that our pieces, are put in good squares. Since on f1 it's very safe, it can later at some point even go to, the long diagonal with g3, bishop b2 if you need to. And, we don't want to really give up the bishop pair in response to a6. Now, in this position, there are 2 ways for black to play. They can either play the immediate knight f6 or the move a6 first, bishop f1, which is the point, and then now bishop g4. So we can see that the difference between these 2 positions is that there's the lack of the move knight f6 included, right? And I think that both are pretty similar, and I think that they will eventually have to transpose if white chooses the critical lines. Now, first, let's talk about actually the position with knight f6 first. I think this is the main move historically, and I think what you will face most often. But I think it's easy for white to claim an advantage here after c3, preparing d4. So yeah, black normally plays a6 here, forcing the bishop to either go to f1 or elsewhere. Some interesting note is that after bishop c4, in this position, black should probably play the move bishop g4 still, and then white will play d4 and get a similar position as in the game, or as in the text. And the point of bishop c4 is interesting, is that the move b5 here is not good at all. And suddenly this position, with the pawn on d4, actually instead of pawn to d4, pawn to a4 here, is better. And this position is actually better than the main line that we're going to be looking at because of this inclusion of the pawn to b5. So this is one interesting way you can try to, surprise your opponent. I learned this from FIDE master Thomas on Twitter actually, so I'll just show the thread where he exactly said this. But that's an interesting way to play. But instead, I'm gonna recommend the main move bishop f1. And yeah, if you play the move e6 there, then simply you block off your own bishop, you allow pawn to d4, and your bishop is just move to d7 without any purpose. So white is just much better here. Instead, bishop g4 is the main move, and now pawn to d4. And the point is that it seems like bishop g4 is like kind of preventing you from pushing pawn to d4, because after c takes d4 and c takes d4, black can play the move bishop takes f3. But this is exactly what we're going to be hoping for, because we can actually take back with the pawn. And we suddenly built this impressive center, and it seems like we do double the pawns, but the fact that we have the impressive center makes, much bigger difference. So instead of bishop takes f3, first let's look at some of these sidelines. g6, interesting. It's trying to prepare a fianchetto setup here, but now we'll play the move bishop e3. The point being that you can't take on e4 because of the nice typical move d5 here. Let's say knight e5, we have queen e4 check, winning the knight, or there's simply no way out. So instead of knight takes e4, bishop g7 is best, but now we have the move knight d2. The point is that if we go to d2, we often have access to like squares like c4, but more importantly, I think is that we want to play h3, and if possible, we can even think about recapturing at some point with the knight. So for example, here bishop takes f3 allows knight takes f3. Since now you cannot take the e-pawn again, since there's the move d5, still with the same tactic. So black will castle, we can play d5. Since now knight to e5 can simply be taken. So black's best move is probably knight b8, trying to reroute the knight. But now we play bishop d4, and white is simply in full control here. We can play on the queen side here. One typical plan is to go for a4, a5, maybe even develop the rook to a3, and then to b3 to attack the b7 pawn, or even just simple rook c1 is typical. White is much better there. So instead of that, castles is probably the best move, but now we can play queen b3, which actually targets the b7 pawn. And in case black plays rook b8, then first off, we can play d5. We're not allowing knight e5 here, so knight a5 is probably best, but now we play queen b6. And this is the point. The bishop on e3 is actually very nice to control some squares on the queen side, so now there is the possible threat of b4, simply trapping the knight. So bishop takes f3 is kind of forced, knight takes f3, and now knight d7, trying to kick away the queen. So now we trade, we can play b4 now, which actually wins the knight. So after black takes the rook, we take back, and the knight is going to be trapped. So we're going to have two pieces for the knight, and a very good position, which is materially, or at least from positional sense, it's completely winning. So we're doing very well in case of rook b8. In case of b5 here, just getting the pawn out of danger, we can play h3 first, which is nice just to win the bishop pair. We take back here with the knight. Grabbing the pawn just allows simple queen d5 with the fork. And so knight a5 here is best. But now queen d3, defending the center, rook c8. And now best here is to play the move pawn to a4. I like also the move pawn to b3, just defending the c4 square, preventing this knight from, entering the c4 square. But I think a4 is best. And the point is, after knight c4, we can even go bishop c1, just defending our b2 pawn. After b4, we can now play bishop g5, since now the position has changed a bit. You can't take the b2 pawn now because of queen b3, and the bishop is covering the c4 square. So we're going to win the knight. And now we're going to simply play rook c1 next with just a simply very good position. Okay, so that's a b5. If knight a5 immediately, then now we can play queen d3, still defending our center. And now we're ready to play on the king side here with h3. And the point is that kind of with the move queen b3 and later to d3, we're improving the position of the queen, and we're also making sure this knight gets to the side of the board, to the edge of the board. After let's say e6, we can play rook ac1, and we simply have a very nice position with the two center pawns. Pawn to h3 is coming next, and this bishop on this diagonal is really blocked off by our own pawns in the center. So yeah, that's in case of g6. In case of pawn to d5 immediately, trying to challenge our center, this doesn't equalize after the e5. And if they go, let's say, okay, knight e4 is interesting, but I believe after the simple knight c3 or even h3, this position should be very good. Guessing after h3, here's the problem. The problem is that you can't take on f3 now, because if you do that, gf3 just simply traps the knight. So I'm guessing you have to go bishop h5, but that allows eventual g4, which is very much possible in this kind of position, I believe. Or even the move e6 here, trying to disrupt black's development, is actually looking very good. After f takes e6, pawn to g4, or knight c3 looks good. Let's see, the computer thinks. Yeah, Okay, the computer even recommends bishop e2. And yeah, I think overall, yeah, there shouldn't be any problems. I'm sure you could work this out if that happens. You know, and if knight d7 here, then we can go for e6 with a nice idea. The point is bishop takes e6 is the only critical move, but after knight c3, you know, we're putting center under pressure, and black has lost a lot of time for their development. So yeah, they can't really move this bishop again, you know, to g4, since they lose d5. So yeah, black is struggling here by a lot. Instead of that, knight g8 is interesting, trying to go after e6, or knight bd2, pawn to e6. Again, you can't play knight takes d4 because of queen a4 check, picking up a piece. So e6, pawn to h3, bishop h5, and knight b3. And, you know, we see that the g8 knight here is forced to waste some tempi here. And, yeah, the black bishops are just struggling to find good squares to work with. We're defending our pawn with the knight on b3, and we're controlling some queenside squares here. So white is just much better here. So yeah, that's if d5. And if bishop takes f3 immediately, we should look at what happens after g takes f3. Now, I've seen some people actually, instead of playing after bishop g4, instead of playing d4, a lot of people play the move h3, but objectively it doesn't give much of an advantage. It does allow this position, let's say g6 and pawn to d3. And, you know, white gets a small edge here, but I really don't think it's like ever enough to prove, you know, a big advantage. So it's playable, and I've seen this actually in the World Cup. I believe a 2600 Grandmaster played this against Nakamura, but only managed to get a draw, which, yeah, is kind of what you can expect from this variation. But it certainly is like a playable way to continue. Instead, d4 is critical, c takes d4, c d4, and now bishop f3, gf3, and now there are two moves here. I mean, there's also a third move of like pawn to g6 here, but I believe that after pawn to d5, this becomes quite unpleasant. Let's say knight b8, you can just continue with like bishop e3 or queen b3. But essentially, the point is that we can always like play moves like queen b3 here, knight d2 to c4, a4, a5, and get a very good position here. We can even play bishop d4 to try to contest the long diagonal. So yeah, overall, we're just doing very well, as long as we, you know, you see the point that we can always like push d5 in case black gives us the opportunity. Instead of that, pawn to e5 is possible. But I think the simple way to play is just to play d5, you know, not allowing black to break up our center, that d4, and the bishop e3. And we're simply going to be attacking this knight in case of bishop e7. Instead of the immediate, you know, taking the pawn here, I think best move is actually to play the move f4. And now you cannot take on e4, I believe, because the bishop takes d4, hitting the knight. So, castles is forced, but now fe5, de5, and now again f4. And black has concrete problems here. Despite our king being a bit weakened, this knight on d4 is simply unstable. So we're going to be much better there. Instead of that, pawn to d5 is the best move, but still here, I think that there are a couple of ways for white to get advantage. I'm going to show you the first line, which is the interesting move pawn to e5, the main move, and after knight h5, continue with f4, hitting the knight on h5 here, pawn to g6, and the f5. Very aggressive, very much possible. Yeah. But it is very wild. But I do like the simple move knight c3, with the point that if you take on e4, white can push d5 and take back with the f pawn and undouble the pawns. So instead, e6 here is best. But now we can play bishop g5, increasing the pressure. And now we see that one nice thing about white's position is that they've developed so quickly that the rook is, you know, already opposing the black king. So here bishop e7 is the only move, you know, blocking down the e file. But now we'll take on f6, bishop takes f6. E takes d5, going for a forcing line. Okay, you can't take on d5 back, so you're gonna have to play knight takes d4. But now we don't want to take on e6 because that will allow knight takes e6. So we'll play the move rook e4, hitting the knight. In case black plays knight f5, then we'll take on e6. Okay, if you take back, then you're gonna simply lose another pawn. So black will probably castle, and then we'll take on f7. King h8 is the best move, but this position I don't believe that, you know, black should equalize at all here. Simply white is up a pawn, and currently 2 pawns, but it's going to be simply 1 pawn in the very near future. But yeah, it doesn't seem to equalize at all. So I'm going to skip that and just go for the main move, queen b6 here. And after this move, we can simply take on e6 again, knight takes e6. And yeah, we don't really win a pawn here, but after knight d5, we really ask a lot of questions to the black pieces. For example, if queen takes b2, we can play rook b1. And, you know, you're going to possibly run into like some knight c7 problems. So because they are attacking the a1 rook, we have to play rook b1 first, and only then can we play knight c7 to take advantage of this pin. Instead of that, queen d8 is best, but now we can simply play the move queen a4, a disruptive check, forcing b5, but now we play knight takes f6, and now we're forcing g takes f6, because queen takes f6, which you would like to do, runs into bishop takes b5 with check, making use of the pin on the a file. So now instead g takes f6 is better, but now after queen a3, let's say queen e7, we still again have the move bishop takes b5 winning a pawn. So if they can't play queen e7, then the question is, how is black going to get castled, right? And the computer assesses this as a slight advantage, though I think that it's clear to say that white is the one in the driver's seat. Like we have, the black king is stuck in the center. If you can't play queen e7 to get your king to safety, we have the same, damaged pawn structure, but white's pieces are much more active, and black has some targets on the queen side here. So yeah, that's one of the possible lines, I believe, against this main move. The move knight f6 followed by bishop g4. But instead, let's look what happens if black plays move a6 first, just without the move knight f6. So after bishop f1 and bishop g4, we go for the same line as in c3. Let's say pawn to e6 here. So we're going to see what happens if black does not play knight f6, right? And so we can play d4 now. And after cd4, if they play the move pawn to d5 now, then we will simply open up the center. E takes d5, queen d5, knight c3, and the best move here is queen h5, trying to attack the knight further and maybe castle long. But now we have two moves. We can either make the position messy with the move d5, which forces bishop f3, gf3, and then now bishop d6, attacking the h2 pawn. So now h3 here is forced, knight e5 is the best move, but now bishop g2, long castles, and knight e4. So this is one of the possible lines, which clearly is very messy, and so this is why the reason why I don't really, I don't really want to recommend this position. But another simple way to play is just to move bishop e2, where we're renewing the threat of pawn to d5. We're also threatening h3 to force black to give up the bishop pair. So very nice move, very simple move, gives us an advantage. So instead of d5, bishop takes f3 is best, but we'll go for the same idea. We double our own pawns, but these pawns in the center are much more of an important factor. After black plays the move d5 here, not allowing us to play d5, we play knight c3 here. And if they play knight f6, then after bishop g5, this actually transposes to the line we just saw before. If they play d takes e4, then this allows them to move pawn to d5, or we're just opening up the position. E d5, knight takes d5, and we're simply going to win back the pawn here after knight f6 and fe4. And, with a nice knight on d5, the king still stuck in the center, our position is already much better. So this is not possible. Instead, if bishop e7, trying to block the e file, and then preparing knight f6 and castles, we'll not allow it because we have the move e takes d5, opening up the e file, e d5, and now bishop g5. This doesn't allow knight f6 because it, allows the doubling of pawns. Takes, that's a problem. In case black plays the move f6, then after the simple move bishop e3, simply we have ideas of queen b3 next. This knight on g8 is really struggling to find a good place to develop, and the inclusion of the move f6 only favors white. So very good position. After bishop g5, in case of king f8, which is the best move, now we can play the very nice move bishop e3. Very nice that we're just maintaining the bishop pair. We have the long-term advantage because black is uncastled. They have problems with the king. White has ideas of maybe playing f4, activating the queen to f3, playing bishop g2 to put pressure on the d5 pawn and the long diagonal. We can also play in combination with queenside ideas like rook c1, knight e4 to c5, things like that. So very good position. It's according to the computer, it's just a slight advantage, but still, I think anyone with human evaluation here would prefer to play the white pieces. So yeah, that essentially covers this move knight c6, back on the third move, and covers this Moscow variation for white. So just a few parting words from this series, or from this video on the Moscow is, I think that it's a very nice weapon to have in the back of your pocket, even if you're an open Sicilian player for many years or all your life. You could easily learn the Moscow Sicilian because there are not a lot of lines to know, and it's really based on understanding. There's a lot of finesse in it, of course, a lot of move order trickery, but in general, it's not very difficult to play. I think that if you have a good positional sense, you like extra space, this variation is going to be one that serves you well. Okay, so that's going to be it from me in this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Bye.